Hello, welcome back to Modern Western Buddhism. We are continuing our long-term look at the topic of meditation. So this course, just to remind you, is covering meditation from soup to nuts. So if you're jumping in here, you may not be getting the full benefits of the material. It's probably better to find the playlist that this video is in, go back and start at the beginning and just work your way through. Although I hope that this material, really wherever you start, will be helpful for people just wherever you happen to be in the process. That being said, let's begin by summarizing the material from the previous video, as we like to do. So last time we talked about advanced motivation for meditation. So we have been spending a long time talking about getting motivated for meditation. Why? Well, when you talk to most meditators, the biggest problem they have is that they don't meditate, right? Or they meditate, but they do 5 minutes one day, an hour the next day, 10 minutes the next day, blah, blah, blah. So their practice isn't consistent. And when life gets in the way, they drop the practice entirely. So why? Why does that happen? Well, if you read the classic sources, and this goes all the way back to the Pali Canon, obviously it's there in the Mahayana canons as well. But let's talk about, just very briefly, sort of an abbreviated version of the Pali Canon approach to this issue, right? If we're looking at the Eightfold Path version of this, why is it that you can't get your butt to the cushion according to that system? Is it just because you have bad karma and you're helpless and for some reason you're inept and there's nothing you can do about it? Or you're just not that good at it, or you're not, whatever, right? All these excuses we make to ourselves, none of that is true actually. So according to the Buddhist worldview, there's no central you that is the real you, sort of as the tent pole holding up the tent that is your body and mind. There's just the aggregates of the body and mind. And those aggregates carry on by the force of accumulated habit, right? So why can't you get your butt to the cushion? Because your set of accumulated habits doesn't include the habit of meditating. So how do you create that habit? Well, you create it just like you would create any other activity of the body and mind, right? This is not a magical process. It's not a mystical process. It's a straightforward common sense process. Your motivation, you're not exerting effort, right? Why? Because you're not motivated. Why? Because you're not interested. Why? Because you don't have the right ideas. Is this making sense? I hope this is making sense. So in Buddhism, you start with right view. Right view, what does that mean? It actually means, when you trace the language and you look at both the later sort of ways of talking about this and the earliest, and you combine them all together, a right view, a view is basically a philosophy or a worldview, or in some cases you could even say a theology. So in the Indian way of thinking about this at the time of the Buddha, there was no separation between sort of secular worldviews, philosophy, and theology. These were all considered just to be view, right? These were just view. How are you looking at the world? And how are you looking at yourself? So if the way that you're looking at the world and yourself is disoriented, not oriented properly, then you won't have interest in the right things. If you don't have interest in the right things, you won't be motivated to pursue the right goals. If you're not motivated to pursue the right goals, there's no way you're going to generate the effort required and the perseverance required, because it's painful, it requires sacrifice. It's uncomfortable. You have to face all these dark things about yourself that you'd rather not face. You have to face all these. So this requires effort and perseverance and patience, right? So you have to have what? The correct view, which gives you the aspiration and the interest in the goal. Then from the aspiration and interest, motivation comes. With the motivation and the drive to get to the goal comes effort, right? So then you start to strive to get to the goal. So if you're not sitting consistently, if you're not making progress, the problem is actually all the way over here. It's in your head. The problem is you don't have the correct viewpoint. It's not that you just suck at meditation and therefore you're never going to be good at it and blah, 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 all these weird things people say. It's so simple. You just need to study more. You need to study more with real teachers, basically become convinced that meditation's a real thing, which is why we spent so much time in the beginning talking about basically, 3,000 years of history on meditation. Here are the facts as they are known across human history with regards to this phenomenon. It's definitely real. Not only that, here's the science. We know from science that this is real. This can be done. Okay, so now we know that the goal is real and can be done. So there should be some inspiration, at least, maybe even some aspiration. You go, oh, that's a great thing I might want to do one day, right? It's not yet motivated. It's not going, I'm going to do that no matter what. I don't care if it kills me. I'm going to get there, right? That is powerful drive. The other one is just sort of, well, I'm interested. Yeah, that sounds nice. That's, it's cool that that's real, and, it'd be nice if I could do a little bit of that, and, you don't have a powerful drive yet. You're just sort of interested, or you aspire, you find it inspiring, or you aspire to it, even though you're not deeply striving. Okay. So we covered before this video a huge amount on motivation. If you'd like to kind of cover all of that, and you should for the reasons I just mentioned, then do go back and watch those videos. And do send me a message to get the notes for that part of the course, okay? So to summarize just the video immediately prior to this one, we talked about the most advanced form of meditation. Now, basically, the argument that I made was you're not going to generate this motivation on day one. It's basically, it relies upon you having already made a lot of progress on the path. And the objection that you get with that from a lot of people is, yeah, but what about all these people that do, certain types of Chan practice or Zen practice or Taoist Zhuang practice or Dzogchen or Mahamudra or blah, 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 blah. What about these people that jump in on day one and they can do these practices right away that require the final types, the most difficult or demanding types of motivation and intention? Well, the reply that I have to that is this. Buddhism is based upon a multiple life worldview. So from our perspective, as a general rule, if you, as a 3-year-old, sit down at a piano and you can play Bach, having looked at sheet music with no one to teach you how to read sheet music, that to us would be a fair indication that you probably played some piano in a previous life, right? If you can spontaneously read Bach and play it with very little effort as a 3-year-old, you probably had some practice at another time, right? With regards to jumping into the most advanced forms of meditative training and the most advanced forms of motivation and intention for that training on day one, I would say you probably did some work before now. Yeah, you probably did some work before today that you don't remember. If you're capable of that, you must have done the work that everyone else has to do to generate those things. They don't come from nowhere. So, yes, some people can jump into that on day one if you're watching this video, then you're probably not one of those people, right? Because those people tend to encounter the very best living teachers of their age, and they tend to encounter those teachers not because they, just happen to meet them by chance, but because they seek them out. They move from home. They travel for months at a time and show up on the doorstep of these people. And then usually those people say, who are you? Get the hell out of here. And they stick around for like a week or 2 weeks with no food, nothing to eat, like just barely surviving. And the teacher goes, okay, you have some heart. Let's give it a try, right? So these people already have extraordinary drive and extraordinary faith in that particular teacher. And this is another thing that makes a lot of people uncomfortable right up front, and that's okay. But a big part of making progress is having, if you don't like the word faith, it's having conviction that the teacher in front of you who's mentoring you, right? I actually prefer the word mentor, right? The mentor that you have chosen actually knows how to get you from point A to point Z on the path. If you don't have conviction that they can do that, what are you doing there, right? Maybe you just kind of find it useful and you're going to just say, well, maybe they can get me to like step B. Okay, cool, right? But these are the type of people that they, like Milarepa, when he heard the name Marpa, he got goosebumps. And immediately when he met Marpa, for whatever reason, he went, oh, wow, this is it. And then he spent years doing all sorts of menial tasks and getting no what we would consider conventional training from Marpa. And when he eventually did, 7 or 8 years later, get sort of conventional teaching on meditative training and so forth from Marpa, he became one of the greatest yogis of Tibetan history, right? Maybe of world history. Milarepa is quite famous. If you don't know who he is, look him up. Milarepa. So, yes, that does happen. You can, for some people, you can generate these advanced kinds of motivations and intentions and jump straight into the most difficult kinds of practices, but most of us aren't those people. And if you want to become like that, there is a systematic, graded, sequential process you can go through to generate that kind of capability. So, it's not magic. You just get the right ideas, aspire to get those results, get motivated to get those results based upon studying more, thinking more about it, meeting practitioners who can actually do it, blah, blah, blah. Following their advice, you then generate effort and start to taste the result. Tasting the result, you start to get even more motivated. You go, wow, it's exactly like they said. And then you do it more. So now we're talking about Maitreya's approach. Oh, right? I got a little taste of this. It's exactly like the text said. It's exactly like my mentor said and my comrades here training with me said it would be. It's exactly like that, which probably means the next couple steps at least are like they said also. You attain those steps. Oh, wow, that's exactly like they said. So now I have 3 steps where it's been precisely what the text described, precisely what my teachers described. You know what? That probably means this system works. Probably means this system will take me as far as it says it can take me, right? And so your motivation then grows even more powerful with the experience. And then you get more effort, more effort, more effort, more capability, more capability, more capability. And so these all grow up together, right? It's not magic. It's common sense. At some point, you gain enough capability that you don't need to latch on to some goal for this little me over here that, oh, me is going to get this big thing and then help all beings, right? You don't need all these big, juicy motivations and big, juicy goals to create the correct behavior that will continue the training process, right? The training process is now what you are, and it's what you do, and therefore it will come to fruition, period. And so then the motivation and intention can start to switch. And it's not like one day it's like this, the next day it's like that. There's a transition from a lot of sort of hard motivations, hardcore motivations, to soft motivations where it's I'm just touching down on the ground of my being every day. And then I act from that. And then I look at the nature of something that appears. And I act based upon what its actual nature is instead of the way that it appeared before I looked at its nature. And that means that you are accumulating the causes to get out of the problem. And you are of ultimate benefit to others in the process of your training, which is compassion, right? So again, the flavor of this whole process starts to flip at some point, but it's advanced. And if you want the advanced stuff, you need to do the basic stuff. You can't do the higher level skills without the lower level skills. So please take that on board. I cannot emphasize this enough. If you really want to make progress, do the gradual work. Do the step-by-step gradual, seemingly more boring, seemingly more common sense, mundane work, because that's what will bring you to the stuff that seems almost religious, because it just seems so unfathomable that a person's mind could operate in that way. But it can. It can operate that way. And the more of a taste you get of being able to operate that way, the more you're going to want that result. Which means the more you can start to drop away these big goals and targets as your main motivation, right? But again, slow process of transition from one to the other. And then some days you go back a little bit and you're like, oh, you know what? It's all about me. And okay, well, if it's all about me, at least let's aim at nirvana, blah, 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 blah. So then you're working with what are the habits that are manifesting today? Because there's no additional person who is just like the real me. There's just the habits that happen to be here and manifesting currently at any given moment. So I need another set of habits that is working with whatever's appearing all the time, right? Which means I need a big bag of different types of approaches and habits to deal with whatever's occurring skillfully at the time. Okay. Without further ado, let's get into today's proper topic. Today we're going to be talking about dwelling in a conducive environment. This is a really, really incredible subject. And I think for those who have hung in this far, this is where it starts to get, or at least sounds like it's getting a bit more practical, yeah? Like the advice gets a bit more earthy from here. Okay. Give me just one moment and we'll change over to the document. Okie doke. Okay. Here we go. Dwelling in a conducive environment. So, in general, remember, the Bhavanakrama is written for someone who is probably going to go into extended retreat. And based upon the Bhavanakrama's instructions, try to attain at least the first level of samadhi in the shortest period of time possible, which may be 4 months, it may be 6 months, whatever. Lama Tsongkhapa's advice is of a very similar flavor. When you look at the details of Lama Tsongkhapa's life, he not only did he teach a method which is like, okay, here's domino number 1, we're going to knock that down and immediately go to 2 and boom, 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 boom. This is how we're going to carry out the path with no, no frills, no extra, no anything, basically become a monk, start knocking down the pins, and go through the sutra system, get empowerment, go through the tantric system in a very systematic way, and get the hell out of samsara, become of benefit to others, get it done. Right? Now, for us, ordinary folks here in wherever we happen to be, this is an approach that is, of course, true and real, and extremely profound. But we also need some advice based upon the fact that we are not going to be full-time Dharma people in an outward sense, right? We're not going to be, as I sort of began this series, we're not going to be cave-dwelling yogis or people living in monasteries. The other thing is a lot of monks and nuns don't live in monasteries either. They live in retreat centers in the West or in private residences. A lot of them work jobs in order to sustain themselves because their monasteries don't pay for their food and clothing and all of this, right? And medicine and such. So they have to find ways to support themselves. So I think this is actually good advice in general. Okay. So let's just begin with this. It's quite important, I think, right at the outset of understanding what a conducive environment is, to understand what a retreat is. What is a retreat, right? So the Tibetan word for retreat actually literally translates as boundary, right? And so the boundaries that you make are retreat. A retreat is just a boundary you've put on your body, on your speech, or on your mind. That's it. So if tomorrow you woke up and said, today I'm not going to eat chocolate cake, that's a retreat. It's a retreat from chocolate cake. So in terms of sort of the general understanding of boundaries and how these boundaries are used for training the mind, right? There are sort of relaxed boundaries and there are sort of hardcore boundaries. And you find this teaching, by the way, not just in the Mahayana teaching system. We could find this very same way of dividing things up in the Path of Purification by Buddhaghosa. It's a 4th century Theravadan commentator, extremely important commentator in the Theravadan tradition. So before we jump into this, let's talk about one example from the Path of Purification, Bhavanakrama, or not Bhavanakrama, I'm sorry, Buddhaghosa's, Venerable Buddhaghosa's text. So, for example, he talks about, there's a practice in Theravadan monasticism where a monk or nun takes a vow for some period of time to not lay down. They won't lay flat on the ground. And Venerable Buddhaghosa talks about, here's sort of the strictest version, and here's sort of the midway version, and here's the most relaxed version of this. And here's when you've broken the retreat, right? You're no longer in this retreat. You need to start over if X, Y, and Z occurs. And so, for example, he says the strictest version of this retreat is that you don't even lean up against a wall or sit on a chair that has a back on it. That the most strictest version is that you keep yourself upright and self-supported, and that even if you fall asleep, right, your head might dip down, but your back must stay upright. And for those who are the most capable, the most driven, this is the method, right? Secondly, if you're a little bit less capable or a little bit less driven, it's also beneficial, he says, if you are doing the not laying down type of retreat. You could use a wall, right, where you don't lay down, but occasionally you lean up against a wall in a seated position. or you're on a chair that has a back on it, and you do that in a seated position. And then I think he said the lowest level was you can actually, during your seated sessions, in addition to sort of these other things, right, where you could lean against a wall or what have you, that also you can use a scarf, right? Meditators would tie like a scarf around their body so that when they were sitting, if they fell asleep, that they wouldn't end up falling over. Because if you fell over, now you're laying down. If you lay down, then you've broken the conditions of the retreat. So again, kind of an advanced example, right? I'm going to talk about sleeping at a later point in this series. It's extremely important that you sleep. It's extremely important that you sleep regularly. This is a teaching that the Buddha actually gives in the Pali Canon, right? If you don't sleep properly, it increases a mental factor called laxity. And laxity has a secondary effect of increasing all of your other delusions, all of your other afflictions, all of your other negative emotions. So we all know this. You get tired, you get mentally and physically cranky, and you get more angry, more horny, more attached to silly things, more irritable, right? So sleep, and sleep properly. Sleep on a good schedule. There may be conditions in retreat where it's better not to sleep for specific training reasons for certain periods of time, but don't do this as a regular practice unless you're already extremely capable. Okay, so what are the boundaries of retreat that are a bit less demanding than that, right? Physical boundaries. The strictest practice is you have one room that you stay in for the retreat, and you do not leave that room, right? You never leave that room. So this means you need an attendant who's going to handle taking waste out of the room and basically bringing your meals in and all of this, right? So this is going to be something difficult for us to apply as modern lay people, especially when we're doing our normal practices at home. So the next level down is you create a boundary outside the room, right? So for example, maybe your house is the boundary. You won't leave your house. So you can say, well, not only will I not leave my house, but I will only go to the restroom, to the kitchen, and to the meditation room only, right? And then maybe even you're sleeping in the meditation room instead of your regular room or whatever. So this can be a type of physical boundary you set up. So when you're doing retreats, if you haven't done a lot of retreats, don't squeeze yourself too hard, right? You can set an even more relaxed boundary where you go, for me, if I just stay in the house for a week and I only move between two rooms and I don't talk to anyone and all of these things, I'm going to go nuts. So maybe you set a boundary and you say, okay, there's a walk I can take where I won't see very many people on the road, and there's a nice nature park, and I'll go sit in the park, a little bit during my retreat, right? So work with your own capability, because you want the retreat to put pressure on your practice, but not break your practice, right? Now, this is an important point because some people have a lot of determination, especially when they're doing sort of a one-off activity. But you want the retreat to add to your strength and power. And if you push too hard, right, put too much pressure on the system will break down. And you find this in the Zen tradition, you find it in the Chan tradition, you find it in the Tibetan tradition, the Indian tradition. There's something called meditation sickness or wind sickness, lung, right? Basically, you fry your brain. Your frontal lobe gets completely screwed up because you've been trying to force your attention to stay somewhere without having done a lot of preparation for this activity. And when you get out of the retreat, just even thinking about the idea of making your mind do something or go somewhere or placing it on something gives you cold sweats, deep anxiety. You feel completely unmotivated. You don't want to do anything. It's like a total frontal lobe kind of uh, regulatory function breakdown, where the part of your mind that is meant to direct everything else where it's supposed to go essentially doesn't function the way that it should. And you can read more about this, for example, in Complete Poison Blossoms from a Thicket of Thorns by Hakuan Zenji. He gives an excellent description of this. He spent, I can't remember what it was, like a month. He basically went from doing nothing to moving into a cave right away and spent a month sitting, without moving, doing an extremely strict no laying down retreat. And he said that after this retreat, he was broken, as psychologically and physically broken. Like he could barely walk around. He could barely do anything. He could barely think. His emotions were all screwed up. And he had to go to I think actually, they don't say this in the text, but from the description, he had to go to a Taoist priest who gave him some practices to fix the movement of the winds and the qi in his body and all of this. And he was able to correct the problem. But in any case, uh, don't do that. Yeah? Like a guitar string. Like a guitar string, you tighten it up, you tighten, tighten, tighten until it makes a nice sound, right? So it's under pressure, it's tight, it is, if you pull it, it's not going to move very much, it's very much under tension, but too much pressure, the string just snaps, and it doesn't make a good sound anyway, right? So your practice should be under pressure, and it doubly so, maybe triply so when you're in retreat, but know yourself, know your limitations, and make your retreat relaxed enough that it has real benefit to you. Okay? So, regarding boundaries for speech, the strictest boundary for speech is not talking to anyone. So you maintain complete silence the entire time. You don't even talk to fellow comrades in the retreat or your teachers. The next level down is that you have rules for how and when you break your silence. So, for example, maybe you do a retreat for at home, but you're doing an extended retreat for 3 weeks or a month, right? And you're going to need to do some stuff outside the retreat to maintain your life, because if you don't, you can't do the retreat, right? So it's a question of getting to do the retreat, but having to have rules for when you talk to people so that the rest of life doesn't fall apart, or not doing the retreat at all, right? Isn't it better to do the retreat? Yes. So the next level down is you set certain rules. You say, okay, after 5 o'clock, when I've done blah, 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 blah training, I've gotten all this work done for the day. After 5 o'clock, there are 3 hours where I will be open for conversation, say, when the kids get home from school, when my wife gets home from work, that I'll talk to people a little bit during those hours, and then from 8 o'clock until the end of the day, I'll be silent again when everyone's kind of gone to their rooms and is settling in for the evening. Finally, if you're going to do sort of a blended approach like that, where you're setting rules that are appropriate for your circumstance, still, you want to avoid communicating in a meaningless way during those hours. You want to keep your communication sort of, brief and meaningful. Just in general, it might be meaningful to chat with your kids about their day and, make sure that your kids are doing okay or your spouse is doing okay or what have you. But you don't want to get into fights. You don't want to get into really long conversations about like politics or, you want to keep your conversations kind of cordial, brief, meaningful, but don't spend a lot of time just chit-chatting and getting your mind worked up, right? In particular, don't get on social media and start chatting with strangers about the color of an orange, I mean, there's no reason to do any of that if you're in retreat. Finally, the very essence of what it means to be in retreat is to have boundaries on your mind, right? Because most of us don't have any control over our minds, we first try to control the body and the speech. Now, you might remember, if you go back in this course, I gave a lot of instructions, a lot of advice on just getting organized in your life, getting yourself on a calendar, getting on a schedule, trying to do things in a more regimented way, trying to be focused in each period of your day. Why? Because this is the part of your mind that you have access to. You have access to your body and your speech. Your mind is mostly out of your control, and you're unaware of most of what's happening in your mind, unless you've been doing a lot of training. So if you want to start taking control of the process and being able to direct your mind where you want it, when you want it, for as long as you want it, first you need to be able to direct the mind and the speech where you want them, when you want them, for mostly as long as you want them, which means you need to be on a schedule, right? So in terms of formal retreat, again, the boundaries on your mind are actually the most important boundaries, right? So you want to minimize all unnecessary sensory, motivational, and conceptual stimulation, right? So any type of outside reading unrelated to the retreat, you don't cut it out completely. Any kind of sort of things that stimulate your political motivations or your intellectual motivations, like where you want to, you want to save the manatees or whatever, you need to put that aside for the duration of the retreat. You're trying to get the mind as settled as possible. It goes without saying you don't want to stimulate your five senses too much, right? Because you're trying to get the mind to turn inwards and then to work with the mind itself. So if you're stimulating all five of your senses over and over again, the mind's going to be pulled out of itself and directed outwards over and over and over again, right? So again, don't squeeze yourself too hard if you're doing retreats at home, and if you haven't done a lot of retreat. But basically, you don't want to make it so slack that you're, like surfing the internet and doing a bunch of shopping, and like going into town and shopping for hours. You know what I mean? You might need to go buy groceries. Okay, buy what you need, put it in a bag, nod to the person at the counter, and come home. Or in the UK, they have a lot of grocery delivery services. Just, set up a standard order. Here's what I'm going to need for a week. You hit send. Somebody shows up at your door. You put it away. Say thank you to the guy. And that's it. Okay. So in terms of the general understanding of what retreat is, right? And remember, here we're talking about trying to attain samadhi. So attaining samadhi is going to require that you do some retreat. There's no way around that. But what we're hoping to do is to make some progress at least towards samadhi without having to do retreats that are more than a month, or maybe on the outside, maybe 3 months at a time, or maybe at least 1 3-month retreat at some point. So if you're at the stage where you're thinking, okay, I'm going to go into retreat, hardcore retreat for a month or 3 months, you really need certain really specific conditions, right? You want the conditions to be as ideal as possible, because to get the mind to settle down enough that you can get it into a state of samadhi for the first time and then stabilize that condition and make it sort of normal, you need a very conducive environment. This is not something you're probably going to do for the first time in an environment that isn't good or conducive. After you've done it, you can probably bring it back to conditions that are distracting and less than ideal and maybe even horrific circumstances. But that's going to be much harder, much harder, probably impossible for most people if you haven't have this attainment in a condition that's ideal or closer to ideal. So what's the ideal condition? So the presentation here is a blend of mainly two sources, right? So Lama Tsongkhapa's presentation of the Bhavanakrama by Venerable Kamalashila, again, so we're sort of doing the Indian and Tibetan presentation of what are the ideal external conditions. I also borrowed from the Pali tradition, so the one of the Nikayas here, right? I don't want to try to pronounce Pali because I'm not a Pali scholar. So, but one of the Nikayas here has a description of, here are the external conditions that you need. And actually, it's almost identical with the later Indian tradition and the Tibetan tradition, as these things tend to be. In fact, the more that I study all of this and I look at all the traditions, they all use the same stuff. The variations are very small, but I digress. Okay. The first condition is that you need to have easy access to the necessities. Easy access to food, water, the clothing that you might need, medicine, right? The Nikaya says medicines and provisions that you might need when you're sick. Obviously, if you're in retreat, you're trying to reduce the stimulation for your senses. If you're in retreat with other people, you want to be considerate and reduce the stimulation to their senses also, right? So keep your needs extremely simple and minimalist. You don't need any luxuries. Just what will keep you alive, what will make the body function properly. That's it, right? Good food, decent water, maybe some tea or coffee, and access to a doctor or something if you needed one, and so on. Now, it also mentions that if you're going into retreat, it's quite important that your provisions for that retreat were acquired in an honest way. And they talk about this in the Pali tradition as being a right livelihood or a wrong livelihood. So ways of sustaining yourself. That's what a livelihood is, right? So if you're in a business where you sell or make weapons, or where you sell, you do human trafficking or sell prostitutes, or if you're in the slaughtering business where you're slaughtering animals, right? If you're making and selling intoxicants, or if you're making and selling poison to like if you had an extermination company or something, all of these are considered to be wrong livelihoods. They involve too many actions that are harmful to other beings, and this has a sort of psychological effect that carries over into your retreat. So you want to make sure that your provisions for your retreat are acquired in an honest, straight up, ethical manner. Also, right livelihood, and this is mostly for monks, but it really does apply to us also in a lot of regards. Like if you're in the finance business and your model for getting people to invest in things is just lying your ass off, that's not something that when you get into retreat is going to serve you well, because you need a mind that's highly discerning about how things actually are. And if you practice over and over and over and over again, trying to twist reality into something that it's not in order to convince people to buy some type of investment, this has a psychological effect that will carry over into your training. So you need to avoid or stop types of making a living or ways of making a living within some type of career where you're lying to a lot of people or threatening people or basically scamming people, or where you have to do a lot of flattery to get your work done. That you can't do your work without flattering, like sort of falsely flattering a lot of people, which is a lie, by the way. types of work where you have to destroy huge natural areas, like you know, like certain types of logging jobs, for example. Not all types, but some types. Also, I think there's a great deal of advertising work that probably isn't suitable these days, where basically you're trying to figure out how to convince people that if they don't buy the right type of scotch, that they're going to die or not get fucked, right? Like that type of work, in terms of your motivation and intention that you have to carry around 60 hours a week, is out of line with the work you're trying to do mentally the rest of the time in terms of your training. So if you want this other type of result, the type of result we're talking about in terms of mental training, you can't you can't basically rape, burn, and pillage like a bandit in your ordinary activity and then expect that, well, I'll show up for church on Sunday and ask for forgiveness and everything will be fine. Buddhism is a cause and effect type of system of psychology. If all your causes over here are garbage, you're not going to be able to create an effect over here that's not garbage. Ethics and concentration grow together like a tree that's planted with a vine, right? So the concentration starts to grow the ethics start to grow, right? And as the ethics grow, the vine of concentration grows up using the ethics as a support. So without the ethics, the vine can't ever reach the canopy. The vine of concentration has to climb the tree of ethics. It can't arise out of nothing. And we'll have a more extended conversation about that when we get to ethics in this set of prerequisites. In terms of diet, in terms of how you eat, the Bhavanakrama recommends for the period of time that you're in retreat trying to attain samadhi for the first time, a vegetarian diet is better. And when they say vegetarian, they mean to avoid both meat and fish. Also, there are a few recommendations where they say, more or less just try to avoid eating unhealthy foods. That's a bit too general, but, eating a lot of, again, I mean, this stuff you can find in the Pali Canon, right? Eating a lot of oil, a lot of white refined sugar, and so on and so forth. You just want the body and mind to be very light, very fresh, very awake. And if you're eating a lot of heavy, unhealthy food, then the mind won't be as fresh and sharp and capable. And you need it to be very much fresh, sharp, and capable. Also, there are some texts that recommend avoiding garlic and onions and other things in the allium family, like chives, shallots, leeks. Some texts recommend avoiding, I always mispronounce this, afuedita. It's a seasoning in India that's sort of like garlic and onions. And some Tibetan texts and Japanese texts also recommend avoiding radishes. In any case, the point there is actually, insofar as I understand, is actually it has more to do with you doing a retreat with other people in a large group, where you eat these things and then your breath and your body smell really bad, especially if you're not showering and all that. Right? You're in the middle of the heat of the Indian summer and you're eating a bunch of garlic. And so this distracts other people who are training with you. Or it distracts you, or you have to sit far away from everyone else in order to do the training. That's actually the way this rule came about. There was one monk who had eaten a bunch of garlic or onions or something, and he was sitting far away from the other monks. And the Buddha said, "Why are you sitting all the way over there?" And he says, "Oh, I ate all these garlic and onions, and I didn't want to disturb everyone." And he goes, "Okay, no, we need to sit together and do our training together, so just avoid the garlic and onions." Okay, we could say more about that, but there's not a whole lot of reason to. Just in general, vegetarianism is actually not required to do this training, in general. If you want to attain samadhi, it might be better to be vegetarian, but it's actually not 100% required. It can help, It makes the mind a little bit more subtle, because the mind just isn't as heavy when you have basically fruits and vegetables and grains and nuts and seeds and all of this as the fuel, rather than um, rather than the flesh of an animal or a fish. But again, there are people that I have heard of who ate meat and attained samadhi while eating meat. So again, a bit of a personal preference, probably a bit of an advantage to avoid it while trying to do this, but again, we could go to a bunch of different sources and we'll get different answers. So it's a bit ambiguous. A good shelter is the second major thing, right? Now, a good shelter mainly has to do with safety, actually. So you want a place that you're not going to be interrupted by wild animals or thieves or people that have like weirdo, erratic kind of emotional outbursts and strange personalities, right? For people in Asia, quite often they were very deeply concerned that there might be pretas or hungry ghosts or things around, or maybe even just other types of evil presences that would try to interfere with their practice. Just in general, if you feel fear for your life or your resources, you're going to be extremely distracted, right? This is not a mystical thing. So if you believe that there are ghosts, and you believe that the place you're doing meditation has a ghost and that it's trying to harm you, this is a huge distraction for you, isn't it? Whether or not there is a ghost, there very well may be a ghost, but regardless of whether there is or not, if you think there is and you're extremely distracted by it, good luck trying to develop samadhi for the first time in that environment, right? So this is another common sense sort of thing. You want a place that is free from things that are sort of dangerous and malicious so that you can focus on what you're doing. In that regard, sort of the positive side, the flip side of that is it's better if you can do your training in a place where other people have succeeded in their training. So if there is a particular location where somebody has done extended retreat, a year, 2 years, 10 years of retreat in that place, again, it's so inspiring to be in that environment. And whether or not there's a real sort of power in that environment because they did that gives you a real boost from the outside, right? Like maybe there is something in that environment that gives you a boost externally. Maybe that's true. But certainly knowing, right? You knowing, sitting there knowing someone else sat here and they did this same practice and they accomplished it. They were a person just like me. They started just like me. They struggled just like me. Has a powerful effect, right? So powerful to know that somebody sat right where you sat and accomplished the goal of the training that you're trying to do right now. So powerful. Now, if you can't dwell in a place that has been blessed by a great yogi doing a decade or two of retreat there, then the second best would be have a spiritual leader from your tradition come to your home and bless your training environment, right? Do a ceremony and bless that environment. Because in the same way, now in your mind, you're going, okay, someone who did the training that I'm involved in, blah, 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 came here and basically consecrated this space or approved this space or energized this space so that I can also do this, right? So whether or not such a kind of consecration or empowerment of that space has a real external effect, internally, psychologically, knowing this, that someone came and sort of said, yes, you can do it here, the way that you have it arranged is fine, right? It has a powerful effect on your ability to do the work, or it can. Now, minimally, If you can't do that, then you want to have a part of your home that you keep clean, organized, kind of away from the other psychological associations of the home, away from the place where you and your husband often get into fights, or you and your child often get into fights, blah, blah, blah. You want a place that's sort of devoted to the training, and you don't do anything but train in that portion of the house. Now, that could mean that you either have a room that is entirely dedicated to training, right? So maybe it's almost like a library. You have the text there, you have your seat there. You come in there and watch Dharma videos, or it could be a portion of a room. So, like my training area, for example, is in the living room because we don't have enough rooms for me to have one room to just train in. So, half of the living room area, or a third of the living room area, is my training space and my library. And then what you see behind me is the community living room where my wife and future kids will, have Friday night game nights and blah, blah, blah. So if you're like me, you can have sort of the minimal thing where you have an area of your home that has the psychological association with training, right? You have your altar there. It's set up as properly as you can set up your altar. You have your training mat there. You don't do anything in that little space, that little sub area of your home, except for do your training. That's it. Um, this is another sort of general guideline. If you know that in a particular place that really bad things have happened, then psychologically that's not good, right? Like if you're sitting in an old prison building and you know that a lot of terrible things have happened there, it just has a subliminal kind of negative effect on your outlook and the training process. So especially in the beginning, the effect of this might be kind of subtle, but they recommend basically avoiding places that have those kinds of associations. Okay. So we had a good shelter, and now we need a wholesome location. So the place that you find the shelter, right? So the wider environment in which the shelter is located should have a reasonably good climate to which you can easily adapt. So Yangtze Rinpoche, a great Rinpoche, a highly realized Rinpoche in the Tibetan tradition, recommends if you have the choice, for example, between a hotter climate and a cooler climate, choose the cooler one. If you have the choice between a lower altitude and a higher altitude, choose the higher. And the reason he says this is that higher altitudes with cooler temperatures usually have less insects and bugs that might bite you and so on. Also, our minds tend to be a little bit brighter and fresher when we're in a cool environment rather than a hot one. Also, we want to avoid environments that are moldy, wet, buggy, or otherwise unsuitable because they may cause physical illness. So even if you were meditating in a cave, you want to make sure that that particular cave, isn't infested with bats and cockroaches, for example. Because if it's a dwelling place for those kinds of creatures, then bat droppings, for example, have pathogens in them that can cause respiratory illness. So you'll get into your retreat for like 3 or 4 days, and then you'll get debilitating pneumonia and die in this cave, which doesn't bode well for your training in samadhi. So even all the way back to the Pali Canon, remember these are guys and gals who are dwelling in the forests and the caves of India. It says, find locations that have little contact with flies, mosquitoes, wind, the burning sun, and serpents. So places that are basically you're not going to be constantly attacked by bugs or strong winds or the hot sun or dangerous animals, right? So places where you're not going to get injured or sick. That's the idea. Next, having good companions. So, a good companion in this context is somebody that has the same moral commitments, the same religious views, and that they're doing the same training. They're entirely harmonious with the work you're trying to get done. That's the best. Now, obviously, in the modern world, people traveling all over the place and training in multiple traditions, they might not have exactly the same moral commitments. They may not have exactly the same religious perspective on the training that you're doing, but at a minimum, they should be doing sort of the same core practice that you're doing, right? So maybe you're trying to attain shamatha using a technique from the Tibetan corpus, but the only retreat circumstance that was available to you was a modern mindfulness retreat. And so most of the people there have these secular values. They're sort of doing these mindfulness things that are disconnected from the main teachings that you're involved in, blah, blah, blah. They don't have the moral commitments. But they're doing enough of the same stuff that you can go there and it acts as a support, a moral support, and somewhat a technical support for the work you're trying to do, right? Ideally, you want to be in retreat where you have close contact with a personal mentor for the training that you're doing. Now, in modern times, this is so easy because from home, if you wanted to do a 3-month retreat, you are one email away, or one text away, or one phone call away from your High Lama or great teacher who might be living in the woods in Cambodia or in Kathmandu, right? So, in this regard, we're quite blessed. Um, Now, I wanted to tie this back also because there's so much in the modern times where it's like, oh, you don't need teachers to do this, just read books and blah, blah, blah. But right there in the Nikaya, it says you want to have access to, when you're doing retreat, trying to gain samadhi, you want to have access to elder practitioners, elder brothers and sisters on the path who are learned, also important, heirs to the heritage, right? They've actually inherited a lineage of teaching. They're experts on the Dharma, so these are not beginners. They're not your peers. These are people that exceed you. Experts on the discipline, so this is Vinaya, so they are ethically sound. Experts on the outlines, so they understand the steps and stages of the training that you're involved in, the outline of the teaching that you're trying to accomplish. And how does this work? Well, you approach them occasionally and you inquire. And this is a quote from the Nikaya. How is this, sir? What is the meaning of this? And the senior practitioners disclose to you what has not been disclosed, clear up what is obscure, dispel perplexity about numerous perplexing points, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the trainee remains honest and open, telling them, here's exactly what's going on, here's what I experienced, here's what I'm confused about, what does this mean? And the experienced person says to them, ah, you know, it's like this, it's like that, here's what you're not doing right. So it's only by revealing yourself as you really are to the teacher, to the virtuous friend, and to your comrades where relevant, that you can make progress. So this is a practice. By the time you get to meditation training, according to Buddhism, right? You could do the ethics and the character development by reading books and going to classes and doing the general teaching. When you get to meditation, you need a mentor. You need, in particular, if you're going into retreat for a long time to attain samadhi for the first time, you need access to advanced practitioners who have done this, who can give you advice as things come up. Because I guarantee you, when you turn the mind inwards and you start trying to do high level things with your mind, weird things are going to happen. Extremely strange. Your mind creates your entire reality. Everything that you're sitting in is a creation of your mind. Now, whether or not there's an external reality that is sort of a reflection of what appears in your mind is not the point. What you see is not that external reality. What you see is a representation of that reality generated by your mind. So your entire environment is mind generated, right? So do you think that when you start to turn your mind inwards and collapse your mind's creative capabilities, and shrink them into a smaller and smaller space and try to get the mind to focus on one thing that it's creating and do all this work, do you think that some weird things might happen? I mean, some weird things have to happen, right? Okay, let's move on. The final factor is seclusion. So when you're in retreat, the Nikaya says your lodging should neither be too far from provisions nor too close, and it should possess a means for going and returning. Plus, during the daytime, it should not be disturbed by people, and at night, it should be quiet and still. You find the same advice, or very similar advice, in the Bhavanakrama tradition and the Tibetan tradition of Je Tsongkhapa. So, that's pretty straightforward. For your training space at home, obviously it's best not to choose places where other activities are carried out during the day. So if you're in retreat and your retreat is your home office, but you share your home office with your wife or your husband, and they're in there working all day long and taking phone calls or whatever, that's not going to work, right? So you need some space that is the quietest and least used area of your home, that has no other associations besides the work that you're doing with your training. If needed, if you don't have a space that's quiet enough, then you need to find a location away from your home that meets the fullest possible requirements that we just talked about. One of my teachers says, actually two of my teachers say that even better than going to a retreat center somewhere is just get a hotel room, Get a hotel room in a really, really quiet part of town that's a safe part of town, in an inexpensive hotel, and do your retreat there. Very, very quiet. There's a buffet downstairs. You can get food delivered. It will be close to a hospital because it's in the middle of town in case you get injured or something weird happens, right? So it meets all the requirements. Your teachers are a phone call away if you need moral support or you need guidance. So I've gotten that recommendation many, many times. Okay, since we're a bit over an hour and a half, we will wrap it up here, and we're going to cover basically how to do a retreat in the midst of life, and how you take ordinary activities and turn them into a support for your meditative training in an abbreviated way in the next video. So today, what did we cover? We covered the third condition, dwelling in a conducive environment. And we covered what a retreat actually means. It means setting boundaries on the body, speech, and mind for the purpose of attaining some particular outcome or training in some particular practice, right? And then we covered the 5 or 6 criteria that the ideal retreat situation has if you were going to do a month or you were going to do 3 months of retreat. And those are quite simple. You need to have access to provisions. You need shelter that's basically safe and won't make you sick if you stay there for a long time. You need a climate that is not going to kill you or be extremely distracting. And ideally, you'd have companions around you that are doing the same practice so that you have moral support. More importantly, you want to have access to at least one experienced mentor who has accomplished the practice, so they can give you advice as things come up. And then seclusion. You want the place to be quiet and remote enough that you're just not distracted by the things that normally come up, right? And you're not distracted by noises of people during the day, and you're not distracted by, animals screaming in the middle of the night, most of whom you don't even know what kind of animal that is, right? I mean, how distracting is it if you go to some retreat in the middle of the woods and you hear you went to a different state You flew on a plane, you got there, you drove way out in the middle of nowhere, and now there are all these bugs whose chirp you've never heard. And there are all of these animal calls that you've never heard, right? You don't know what any of those things are. And if you're a certain type of person, that freaks you out. If that sort of thing freaks you out, it's better to just get a hotel room in your town, in the quiet part of town, a part of town that's safe, and just do your retreat in the hotel, right? If you're doing a retreat at home, make sure that it's in a quiet area of the house, blah, blah, blah. Set your boundaries up in an appropriate way so that you minimize distraction. That's it. It's actually pretty simple. This is one of the easier sort of topics in the whole discussion. Okay. Thank you for joining me. And per the usual, I do have a Patreon if you want to support me there. If not, that's quite all right. I'm doing just fine. That being said, the donations to the Patreon go towards supporting my personal practice. So that means making donations to Buddhist organizations, going into retreat, and buying materials for my PhD work and my personal studies of Buddhism. So if you'd like to make a donation, that would be appreciated, but it's not required. In terms of the purpose of this channel, once again, the purpose of this channel is to support your ongoing development in whatever lineage of Buddhism you happen to find yourself in. It's not required that you join the type of Buddhism that I'm doing, or that you do exactly the type of practices I'm doing. The purpose here is really to support people in the modern world who have a mostly modern education, to really understand what all of this Buddhist stuff is, so that you can follow whatever lineage you're already in to the very, very best possible degree and actually make progress in that lineage. That's my hope. In any case, thank you for joining me, and I will see you next week.